The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 22. Other People's Notions. The great towers of Rochester Cathedral had come within Bryce's view before he had made up his mind as to the next step in this last stage of his campaign. He had ridden away from the Saxonsteade Arms, feeling that he had got to do something at once, but he was not quite clear in his mind as to what that something exactly was. But now, as he topped a rise in the road, and saw Rochester lying in its hollow beneath him, the summer sun shining on its red roofs and grey walls, he suddenly came to a decision, and instead of riding straight ahead into the old city, he turned off at a by-road, made a line across the northern outskirts, and headed for the golf links. He was almost certain to find Mary Bewery there at that hour, and he wanted to see her at once. The time for his great stroke had come. But Mary Bewery was not there, had not been there that morning, said the caddy master. There were only a few players out. In one of them, coming towards the clubhouse, Bryce recognised Sackville Bonham, and at sight of Sackville, Bryce had an inspiration. Mary Bewery would not come up to the links now before afternoon. He, Bryce, would lunch there and then go towards Rochester, to meet her by the path across the fields on which he had waylaid her after his visit to Leicestershire. And meanwhile he would inveigle Sackville Bonham into conversation. Sackville fell readily into Bryce's trap. He was the sort of youth who loves to talk, especially in a hinting and mysterious fashion. And when Bryce, after treating him to an appetizer in the bar of the clubhouse, had suggested that they should lunch together and got him into a quiet corner of the dining-room, he launched forth at once on the pertinent matter of the day. "Heard all about this discovery of those missing Saxonsteade diamonds?" he asked, as he and Bryce picked up their knives and forks. "Queer business, that, isn't it? Of course, it's got to do with those murders." "Think so?" asked Bryce. "Can anybody think anything else?" said Sackville in his best dogmatic manner. "Why, the thing's plain. From what's been let out, not much, certainly, but enough. It's quite evident." "What's your theory?" inquired Bryce. "My stepfather, knowing old bird he is, too, sums the whole thing up to a nicety," answered Sackville. "That old chap, Braden, you know, is in possession of that secret. He comes to Rochester about it, but somebody else knows. That somebody gets rid of Braden. Why? So that the secret will be known then only to one, the murderer. See? And why? Why?" "Well, why?" repeated Bryce. "Don't see, so far." "You must be dense, then," said Sackville, with the lofty superiority of youth. "Because of the reward, of course. Don't you know that there's been a standing offer, never withdrawn, of £5,000 for news of those jewels?" "No, I didn't," answered Bryce. "Fact, sir, pure fact," continued Sackville. "Now, 5,000 divided in two is 2,500 each, but 5,000 undivided is what?" "5,000, apparently," said Bryce. "Just so. And," remarked Sackville knowingly, "a man'll do a lot for 5,000. Or, according to your argument, for half of it," said Bryce. "What you, or your stepfather's, aiming at comes to this, that suspicion rests on Braden's sharer in the secret, that is." "And why not?" asked Sackville. "Look at what we know. From the account in the paper this morning, this other chap, Glassdale, waits a bit until the first excitement about Braden is over. Then he comes forward and tells the Duke where the Duchess's diamonds are planted. Why? So that he can get the £5,000 reward. Plain as pikestaff. Only the police are such fools. And what about Collishaw? Asked Bryce, willing to absorb all his companion's ideas. Part of the game, declared Sackville. Same man that got rid of Braden got rid of that chap. Probably Collishaw knew a bit and had to be silenced. But whether that Glassdale did it all off his own back, or whether he's somebody in with him, that's where the guilt will be fastened in the end. My stepfather says, and it'll be so. Stands to reason. Anybody come forward about that reward your stepfather offered? Asked Bryce. I'm not permitted to say, answered Sackville, but, he added, leaning closer to his companion across the table, I can tell you this, there's wheels within wheels. You understand, and things'll be coming out. Got to. We can't, as a family, let Ransford lie under that cloud. Don't you know? We must clear him. That's precisely why Mr. Folliot offered his reward. Ransford, of course, you know, Bryce, is very much to blame. He ought to have done more himself. And, of course, as my mother and my stepfather say, if Ransford won't do things for himself, well, we must do 'em for him. We couldn't think of anything else. Very good of you all, I'm assured, assented Bryce. Very thoughtful and kindly. Oh, well, said Sackville, who was incapable of perceiving a sneer or of knowing when older men were laughing at him. It's one of those things that one's got to do, under the circumstances. Of course, Miss Bewery isn't Dr. Ransford's daughter, but she is his ward, and we can't allow suspicion to rest on her guardian. You leave it to me, my boy, and you'll see how things will be cleared. Doing a bit underground, eh? Asked Bryce. Wait a bit, answered Sackville, with a knowing wink. It's the least expected that happens. What? Bryce replied that Sackville was no doubt right, and began to talk of other matters. He hung about the clubhouse until past 3 o'clock, and then, being well acquainted with Mary Bewery's movements from long observation of them, set out to walk down towards Rochester, leaving his bicycle behind him. If he did not meet Mary on the way, he meant to go to the house. Ransford would be out on his afternoon round of calls. Dick Bewery would be at school. He would find Mary alone, and it was necessary that he should see her alone, and at once, for since morning an entirely new view of affairs had come to him, based on added knowledge, and he now saw a chance which he had never seen before. True, he said to himself, as he walked across the links and over the country which lay between their edge and Rochester, he had not, even now, the accurate knowledge as to the actual murderer of either Braden or Collishaw that he would have liked, but he knew something that would enable him to ask Mary Bewery point blank whether he was to be a friend or enemy. And he was still considering the best way of putting his case to her when, having failed to meet her on the way, he at last turned into the close, and as he approached Ransford's house, saw Mrs. Folliot leaving it. Mary Bewery, like Bryce, had been having a day of events. To begin with, Ransford had received a wire from London, first thing in the morning, which had made him run, breakfastless, to catch the next express. He had left Mary to make arrangements about his day's work, for he had not yet replaced Bryce, and she had been obliged to seek out another practitioner who could find time from his own duties to attend to Ransford's urgent patients. Then she had to see callers who came to the surgery expecting to find Ransford there. And in the middle of a busy morning, Mr. Folliot had dropped in to bring her a bunch of roses, and, once admitted, had shown unmistakable signs of a desire to gossip. "Ransford's out?" he asked as he sat down in the dining-room. "Suppose he is, this time of day?" "He's away," replied Mary. "He went to town by the first express, and I have had a lot of bother arranging about his patients." "Did he hear about this discovery of the Saxonsteade jewels before he went?" asked Folliot. "Suppose he wouldn't, though. Wasn't known until the weekly paper came out this morning. Queer business. You've heard, of course?" "Dr. Short told me," answered Mary. "I don't know any details." Folliot looked meditatively at her a moment. "Got something to do with those other matters, you know," he remarked. "I say, what's Ransford doing about all that?" "About all what, Mr. Folliot?" asked Mary, at once on her guard. "I don't understand you." "You know, all that suspicion, and so on," said Folliot. "Bad position for a professional man, you know, ought to clear himself. Anybody been applying for that reward Ransford offered?" "I don't know anything about it," replied Mary. "Dr. Ransford is very well able to take care of himself, I think. Has anybody applied for yours?" Folliot rose from his chair again, as if he had changed his mind about lingering, and shook his head. "Can't say what my solicitors may or may not have heard or done," he answered. "But queer business, you know, and ought to be settled. Bad for Ransford to have any sort of a cloud over him. Sorry to see it." "Is that why you came forward with a reward?" asked Mary. But to this direct question Folliot made no answer. He muttered something about the advisability of somebody doing something and went away, to Mary's relief. She had no desire to discuss the Paradise mysteries with anybody, especially after Ransford's assurance of the previous evening. But in the middle of the afternoon in walked Mrs. Folliot, a rare caller, and before she had been closeted with Mary 5 minutes brought up the subject again. "I want to speak to you on a very serious matter, my dear Miss Bewery," she said. "You must allow me to speak plainly on account of several things. My superiority in age, you know, and all that." "What's the matter, Mrs. Folliot?" asked Mary, steeling herself against what she felt sure was coming. "Is it very serious? And, pardon me, is it about what Mr. Folliot mentioned to me this morning? Because if it is, I'm not going to discuss that with you or with anybody." "I had no idea that my husband had been here this morning," answered Mrs. Folliot in genuine surprise. "What did he want to talk about?" "In that case, what do you want to talk about?" asked Mary. "Though that doesn't mean that I'm going to talk about it with you." Mrs. Folliot made an effort to understand this remark, and after inspecting her hostess critically for a moment, proceeded in her most judicial manner. "You must see, my dear Miss Bewery, that it is highly necessary that someone should use the utmost persuasion on Dr. Ransford," she said. "He is placing all of you, himself, yourself, your young brother, in most invidious positions by his silence, in society such as, well, such as you get in a cathedral town. You know, no man of reputation can afford to keep silence when his character is affected." Mary picked up some needlework and began to be much occupied with it. "Is Dr. Ransford's character affected?" she asked. "I wasn't aware of it, Mrs. Folliot." "Oh, my dear, you can't be quite so very, shall we say ingenious? as all that?" exclaimed Mrs. Folliot. "These rumours, of course, they are very wicked and cruel ones, but you know they have spread. Dear me, why, they have been common talk." "I don't think my guardian cares twopence for common talk, Mrs. Folliot," answered Mary, "and I am quite sure I don't." "None of us, especially people in our position, can afford to ignore rumours and common talk," said Mrs. Folliot in her loftiest manner. "If we are unfortunately talked about, then it is our solemn, bounden duty to put ourselves right in the eyes of our friends and of society. If I, for instance, my dear, heard anything affecting my, let me say, moral character, I should take steps, the most stringent, drastic, and forceful steps, to put matters to the test. I would not remain under a stigma, no, not for 1 minute." "I hope you will never have occasion to rehabilitate your moral character, Mrs. Folliot," remarked Mary, bending closely over her work. "Such a necessity would indeed be dreadful." "And yet you do not insist, yes, insist, on Dr. Ransford's taking strong steps to clear himself," exclaimed Mrs. Folliot. "Now that, indeed, is a dreadful necessity." "Dr. Ransford," answered Mary, "is quite able to defend and to take care of himself. It is not for me to tell him what to do, or even to advise him what to do. And, since you will talk of this matter, I tell you frankly, Mrs. Folliot, that I don't believe any decent person in Wrychester has the least suspicion or doubt of Dr. Ransford. His denial of any share or complicity in those sad affairs, the mere idea of it, as ridiculous as it's wicked, was quite sufficient. You know very well that at that second inquest he said, on oath, too, that he knew nothing of these affairs. I repeat, there isn't a decent soul in the city doubts that." "Oh, but you're quite wrong," said Mrs. Folliot hurriedly. "Quite wrong, I assure you, my dear. Of course, everybody knows what Dr. Ransford said," very excitedly. "Poor man, I'm given to understand on the occasion you refer to, but then what else could he have said in his own interest? What people want is the proof of his innocence. I could, but I won't, tell you of many of the very best people who are, well, very much exercised over the matter. I could indeed." "Do you count yourself among them?" asked Mary in a cold fashion which would have been a warning to any one but her visitor. "Am I to understand that, Mrs. Folliot?" "Certainly not, my dear," answered Mrs. Folliot promptly. "Otherwise I should not have done what I have done towards establishing the foolish man's innocence." Mary dropped her work and turned a pair of astonished eyes on Mrs. Folliot's large countenance. "You," she exclaimed, "to establish Dr. Ransford's innocence? Why, Mrs. Folliot, what have you done?" Mrs. Folliot toyed a little with the jewelled head of her sunshade. Her expression became almost coy. "Oh, well," she answered after a brief spell of indecision, "perhaps it is as well that you should know, Miss Fury. Of course, when all this sad trouble was made far worse by that second affair, the working man's death, you know, I said to my husband that really one must do something, seeing that Dr. Ransford was so very, very obdurate and wouldn't speak. And as money is nothing, at least as things go, to me or to Mr. Folliot, I insisted that he should offer £1,000 reward to have the thing cleared up. He's a generous and open-handed man, and he agreed with me entirely, and put the thing in hand through his solicitors. And nothing would please us more, my dear, than to have that £1,000 claimed. For of course, if there is to be as I suppose there is, a union between our families, it would be utterly impossible that any cloud could rest on Dr. Ransford, even if he is only your guardian. My son's future wife cannot, of course." Mary laid down her work again and for a full minute stared Mrs. Folliot in the face. "Mrs. Folliot," she said at last, "are you under the impression that I'm thinking of marrying your son?" "I think I've every good reason for believing it," replied Mrs. Folliot. "You've none," retorted Mary, gathering up her work and moving towards the door. "I've no more intention of marrying Mr. Sackville Bonham than of eloping with the bishop. The idea's too absurd to even be thought of." 5 minutes later Mrs. Folliot, heightened in colour, had gone, and presently Mary, glancing after her across the close, saw Bryce approaching the gate of the garden. End of chapter 22.
The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 23. The Unexpected. Mary's first instinct on seeing the approach of Pemberton Bryce, the one man she least desired to see, was to retreat to the back of the house and send the parlour maid to the door to say her mistress was not at home. But she had lately become aware of Bryce's curiously dogged persistence in following up whatever he had in view, and she reflected that if he were sent away, then he would be sure to come back until he had got whatever it was that he wanted. And after a moment's further consideration, she walked out of the front door and confronted him resolutely in the garden. "Dr. Ransford's away," she said with almost unnecessary brusqueness. "He's away until evening." "I don't want him," replied Bryce just as brusquely. "I came to see you." Mary hesitated. She continued to regard Bryce steadily, and Bryce did not like the way in which she was looking at him. He made haste to speak before she could either leave or dismiss him. "You'd better give me a few minutes," he said with a note of warning. "I'm here in your interests, or in Ransford's. I may as well tell you straight out, Ransford's is in serious and imminent danger. That's a fact." "Danger of what?" she demanded. "Arrest. Instant arrest," replied Bryce. "I'm telling you the truth. He'll probably be arrested tonight on his return. There's no imagination in all this. I'm speaking of what I know. I have, curiously enough, got mixed up with these affairs through no seeking of my own, and I know what's behind the scenes. If it were known that I'm letting out secrets to you, I should get into trouble. But I want to warn you." Mary stood before him on the path, hesitating. She knew enough to know that Bryce was telling some sort of truth. It was plain that he had been mixed up in the recent mysteries, and there was a ring of conviction in his voice which impressed her. And suddenly she had visions of Ransford's arrest, of his being dragged off to prison to meet a cruel accusation, of the shame and disgrace, and she hesitated further. "But if that's so," she said at last, "what's the good of coming to me? I can't do anything." "I can," said Bryce significantly. "I know more, much more than the police know, more than anybody knows. I can save Ransford. Understand that." "What do you want now?" she asked. "To talk to you, to tell you how things are," answered Bryce. "What harm is there in that? To make you see how matters stand, and then to show you what I can do to put things right." Mary glanced at an open summer house which stood beneath the beech trees on one side of the garden. She moved towards it and sat down there, and Bryce followed her and seated himself. "Well?" she said. Bryce realized that his moment had arrived. He paused, endeavouring to remember the careful preparations he had made for putting his case. Somehow he was not so clear as to his line of attack as he had been 10 minutes previously. He realized that he had to deal with a young woman who was not likely to be taken in, nor easily deceived, and suddenly he plunged into what he felt to be the thick of things. Whether you, or whether Ransford, whether both or either of you know it or not, he said, the police have been on to Ransford ever since the Collishaw affair. Underground work, you know. Mitchington has been digging into things ever since then, and lately he has had a London detective helping him. Mary, who had carried her work into the garden, had now resumed it, and as Bryce began to talk, she bent over it, steadily stitching. "Well," she said. "Look here," continued Bryce, "has it never struck you, it must have done, that there's considerable mystery about Ransford? But whether it has struck you or not, it's there, and it struck the police forcibly. Mystery connected with him before, long before he ever came here, and associated in some way with that man Braden. Not of late, in years past, and naturally the police have tried to find out what that was." "What have they found out?" asked Mary quietly. "That I'm not at a liberty to tell," replied Bryce. "But I can tell you this. They know, Mitchington and the London man, that there were passages between Ransford and Braden years ago." "How many years ago?" interrupted Mary. Bryce hesitated a moment. He had a suspicion that this self-possessed young woman, who was taking everything more quietly than he had anticipated, might possibly know more than he gave her credit for knowing. He had been watching her fingers since they sat down in the summer house, and his sharp eyes saw that they were as steady as the spire of the cathedral above the trees. He knew from that she was neither frightened nor anxious. "Oh, well, 17 to 20 years ago," he answered. "About that time. There were passages, I say, and they were of a nature which suggests that the reappearance of Braden on Ransford's present stage of life would be extremely unpleasant and unwelcome to Ransford." "Vague," murmured Mary. "Extremely vague." "But quite enough," retorted Bryce, "to give the police the suggestion of a motive. I tell you the police know quite enough to know that Braden was, of all men in the world, the last man Ransford desired to see cross his path again. And on that morning on which the Paradise affair occurred, Braden did cross his path. Therefore, in the conventional police way of thinking and looking at things, there's motive." "Motive for what?" asked Mary. Bryce arrived here at one of his critical stages, and he paused a moment in order to choose his words. "Don't get any false ideas or impressions," he said at last. "I am not accusing Ransford of anything. I am only telling you what I know the police think and are on the very edge of accusing him of. To put it plainly, of murder. They say he had a motive for murdering Braden, and with them motive is everything. It's the first thing they seem to think of, the first question they ask themselves. Why should this man have murdered that man? Do you see? What motive had he? That's the point. And they think, these chaps like Mitchington and the London man, that Ransford certainly had a motive for getting rid of Braden when they met." "What was the motive?" asked Mary. "They found out something, perhaps a good deal, about what happened between Braden and Ransford some years ago," replied Bryce. "And their theory is, if you want to know the truth, that Ransford ran away with Braden's wife, and that Braden had been looking for him ever since." Bryce had kept his eyes on Mary's hands, and now at last he saw the girl's fingers tremble. But her voice was steady enough when she spoke. "Is that mere conjecture on their part, or is it based on any fact?" she asked. "I am not in full knowledge of all their secrets," answered Bryce, "but I've heard enough to know that there's a basis of undeniable fact on which they're going. I know, for instance, beyond doubt, that Braden and Ransford were bosom friends years ago, that Braden was married to a girl whom Ransford had wanted to marry, that Braden's wife suddenly left him mysteriously a few years later, and that at the same time Ransford made an equally mysterious disappearance. The police know all that. What is the inference to be drawn? What inference would anyone, you yourself, for example, draw?" "None, till I've heard what Dr. Ransford had to say," replied Mary. Bryce disliked that ready retort. He was beginning to feel that he was being met by some force stronger than his own. "That's all very well," he remarked. "I don't say that I wouldn't do the same, but I'm only explaining the police position and showing you the danger likely to arise from it. The police theory is this, as far as I can make it out. Ransford years ago did Braden a wrong, and Braden certainly swore revenge when he could find him. Circumstances prevented Braden from seeking him closely for some time. At last they met here by accident. Here the police aren't decided. One theory is that there was an altercation, blows, a struggle, in the course of which Braden met his death. The other is that Ransford deliberately took Braden up into the gallery and flung him through that open doorway. That, observed Mary, with something very like a sneer, seems so likely that I should think it would never occur to anybody but the sort of people you're telling me of. No man of any real sense would believe it for a minute. Some people of plain common sense do believe it for all that, retorted Bryce, for it's quite possible. But as I say, I'm only repeating, and of course the rest of it follows on that. The police theory is that Collishaw witnessed Braden's death at Ransford's hands, that Ransford got to know that Collishaw knew of that, and that he therefore quietly removed Collishaw. And it is on all that they're going and will go. Don't ask me if I think they're right or wrong. I'm only telling you what I know so as to show you what danger Ransford is in. Mary made no immediate answer, and Bryce sat watching her. Somehow, he was at a loss to explain it to himself. Things were not going as he had expected. He had confidently believed that the girl would be frightened, scared, upset, ready to do anything that he had asked or suggested. But she was plainly not frightened, and the fingers which busied themselves with the fancy work had become steady again, and her voice had been steady all along. "Pray," she asked suddenly, with a little satirical inflection of voice which Bryce was quick to notice. "Pray, how is it that you, not a policeman, not a detective, come to know so much of all this? Since when were you taken into the confidence of Mitchington and the mysterious person from London?" "You know as well as I do that I have been dragged into the case against my wishes," answered Bryce almost sullenly. "I was fetched to Braden. I saw him die. It was I who found Collishaw dead. Of course, I've been mixed up, whether I would or not, and I've had to see a good deal of the police, and naturally I've learned things." Mary suddenly turned on him with a flash of the eye which might have warned Bryce that he had signally failed in the main feature of his adventure. "And what have you learnt that makes you come here and tell me all this?" she exclaimed. "Do you think I'm a simpleton, Dr. Bryce? You set out by saying that Dr. Ransford is in danger from the police, and that you know more, much more than the police. What does that mean? Shall I tell you? It means that you know that the police are wrong, and that if you like, you can prove to them that they are wrong. Now then, isn't that so?" "I am in certain possession of facts," began Bryce. Mary stopped him with a look. "My turn," she said. "You are in possession of certain facts. Now, isn't it the truth that the facts you are in possession of are proof enough to you that Dr. Ransford is as innocent as I am? It's no use your trying to deceive me. Isn't that so?" "I could certainly turn the police off his track," admitted Bryce, who was growing highly uncomfortable. "I could divert—" Mary gave him another look, and dropping her needlework continued to watch him steadily. "Do you call yourself a gentleman?" she asked quietly. "Or, we'll leave the term out. Do you call yourself even decently honest? For if you do, how can you have the sheer impudence, more insolence, to come here and tell me all this when you know that the police are wrong, and that you could, to use your own term, which is your way of putting it, turn them off the wrong track? Whatever sort of man are you? Do you want to know my opinion of you in plain words?" "You seem very anxious to give it anyway," retorted Bryce. "I will give it, and it will perhaps put an end to this," answered Mary. "If you are in possession of anything in the way of evidence which would prove Dr. Ransford's innocence, and you are wilfully suppressing it, you are bad, wicked, base, cruel, unfit for any decent being's society. And," she added, as she picked up her work and rose, "you're not going to have any more of mine. A moment. said Bryce. He was conscious that he had somehow played all his cards badly, and he wanted another opening. "You're misunderstanding me altogether. I never said, never inferred, that I wouldn't save Ransford." "Then, if there's need, which I don't admit, you acknowledge that you could save him?" she exclaimed sharply. "Just as I thought. Then, if you're an honest man, a man with any pretensions to honor, why don't you at once? Any man who had such feelings as those I've just mentioned wouldn't hesitate 1 second. But you come and talk about it, as if it were a game. Dr. Bryce, you make me feel sick, mentally, morally sick." Bryce had risen to his feet when Mary rose, and he now stood staring at her. Ever since his boyhood, he had laughed and sneered at the mere idea of the finer feelings. He believed that every man has his price, and that honesty and honor are things useful as terms, but of no real existence. And now he was wondering, really wondering, if this girl meant the things she said, if she really felt a mental loathing of such minds and purposes as he knew his own were, or if it were merely acting on her part. Before he could speak, she turned on him again more fiercely than before. "Shall I tell you something else in plain language?" she asked. "You evidently possess a very small and limited knowledge, if you have any at all, of women, and you apparently don't rate their mental qualities at any high standard. Let me tell you that I am not quite such a fool as you seem to think me. You came here this afternoon to bargain with me. You happen to know how much I respect my guardian, and what I owe him for the care he has taken of me and my brother. You thought to trade on that. You thought you could make a bargain with me. You were to save Dr. Ransford, and for reward you were to have me. You daren't deny it. Dr. Bryce, I can see through you." "I never said it, at any rate," answered Bryce. "Once more I say I'm not a fool," exclaimed Mary. "I saw through you all along, and you failed. I'm not in the least frightened by what you've said. If the police arrest Dr. Ransford knows how to defend himself, and you're not afraid for him. You know you aren't. It wouldn't matter 2 pence to you if he were hanged tomorrow, for you hate him. But look to yourself. Men who cheat and scheme and plot and plan as you do come to bad ends. Mind yours. Mind the wheel doesn't come to full circle. And now, if you please, go away and don't dare to come near me again." Bryce made no answer. He had listened, with an attempt at a smile, to all this fiery indignation, but as Mary spoke the last words he was suddenly aware of something that drew his attention from her and them. Through an opening in Ransford's garden hedge he could see the garden door of the Folliots' house across the close, and at that moment out of it emerged Folliot himself in conversation with Glassdale. Without a word, Bryce snatched up his hat from the table of the summer-house and went swiftly away, a new scheme, a new idea in his mind. End of chapter 23.
The Paradise Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 24. Finesse. Glassdale, journeying into Wrychester half an hour after Bryce had left him at the Saxonsteade Arms, occupied himself during his ride across country in considering the merits of the 2 handbills which Bryce had given him. One announced an offer of £500 reward for information in the Braden-Collishaw matter, the other of £1,000. It struck him as a curious thing that 2 offers should be made. It suggested at once that more than one person was deeply interested in this affair. But who were they? No answer to that question appeared on the handbills, which were, in each case, signed by Wrychester solicitors. To one of these Glassdale, on arriving in the old city, promptly proceeded, selecting the offerer of the larger reward. He presently found himself in the presence of an astute-looking man, who, having had his visitor's name sent in to him, regarded Glassdale with very obvious curiosity. "Mr. Glassdale?" he said inquiringly, as the caller took an offered chair. Are you by any chance the Mr. Glassdale whose name is mentioned in connection with last night's remarkable affair?" He pointed to a copy of the weekly newspaper lying on his desk, and to a formal account of the discovery of the Saxonsteade jewels which had been furnished to the press, at the Duke's request, by Mitchington. Glassdale glanced at it unconcernedly. "The same," he answered. "But I didn't call here on that matter, though what I did call about is certainly relative to it. You've offered a reward for any information that would lead to the solution of that mystery about Braden and the other man, Collishaw." "Of £1,000, yes," replied the solicitor, looking at his visitor with still more curiosity mingled with expectancy. "Can you give any?" Glassdale pulled out the 2 handbills which he had obtained from Bryce. "There are 2 rewards offered," he remarked. "Are they entirely independent of each other?" "We know nothing of the other," answered the solicitor, "except, of course, that it exists. They're quite independent." "Who's offering the £500 one?" asked Glassdale. The solicitor paused, looking his man over. He saw at once that Glassdale had, or believed he had, something to tell, and was disposed to be unusually cautious about telling it. "Well," he replied, after a pause, "I believe, in fact it's an open secret, that the offer of £500 is made by Dr. Ransford." "And yours?" required Glassdale. "Who's at the back of yours, 1,000? The solicitor smiled. "You haven't answered my question, Mr. Glassdale," he observed. "Can you give any information?" Glassdale threw his questioner a significant glance. "Whatever information I might give," he said, "I'd only give to a principal. The principal. From what I've seen and known of all this, there's more in it than is on the surface. I can tell something. I knew John Braden, who, of course, was John Brake, very well for some years. Naturally, I was in his confidence." "About more than the Saxonsteade jewels, you mean?" asked the solicitor. "About more than that," assented Glassdale. "Private matters. I've no doubt I can throw some light, on this Wrychester Paradise affair. But, as I said just now, I'll only deal with the principal. I wouldn't tell you, for instance, as your principal's solicitor." The solicitor smiled again. "Your ideas, Mr. Glassdale, appear to fit in with our principal's," he remarked. "His instructions, strict instructions, to us are that if anybody turns up who can give any information, it's not to be given to us, but to himself." "Wise man," observed Glassdale. "That's just what I feel about it. It's a mistake to share secrets with more than one person." "There is a secret, then?" asked the solicitor, half slyly. "Might be," replied Glassdale. "Who's your client?" The solicitor pulled a scrap of paper towards him and wrote a few words on it. He pushed it towards his caller, and Glassdale picked it up and read what had been written. "Mr. Stephen Folliot, The Close." "You'd better go and see him," said the solicitor, suggestively. "You'll find him reserved enough." Glassdale read and reread the name, as if he were endeavouring to recollect it, or connect it with something. "What particular reason has this man for wishing to find this out?" he inquired. "Can't say, my good sir," replied the solicitor with a smile. "Perhaps he'll tell you. He hasn't told me." Glassdale rose to take his leave, but with his hand on the door he turned. "Is this gentleman a resident in the place?" he asked. "A well-known townsman," replied the solicitor. "You'll easily find his house in the Close. Everybody knows it." Glassdale went away then, and walked slowly towards the cathedral precincts. On his way he passed two places at which he was half inclined to call. One was the police station, the other the office of the solicitors who were acting on behalf of the offerer of £500. He half glanced at the solicitor's door, but on reflection went forward. A man who was walking across the close pointed out the Folliot residence. Glassdale entered by the garden door, and in another minute came face to face with Folliot himself, busied as usual amongst his rose trees. Glassdale saw Folliot and took stock of him before Folliot knew that a stranger was within his gates. Folliot, in an old jacket which he kept for his horticultural labours, was taking slips from a standard. He looked as harmless and peaceful as his occupation. A quiet, inoffensive, somewhat benevolent elderly man engaged in work which suggested leisure and peace. But Glassdale, after a first quick, searching glance, took another and longer one, and went nearer with a discreet laugh. Folliot turned quietly, and seeing the stranger showed no surprise. He had a habit of looking over the top rims of his spectacles at people, and he looked in this way at Glassdale, glancing him up and down calmly. Glassdale lifted his slouch hat and advanced. "Mr. Folliot, I believe, sir?" he said. "Mr. Stephen Folliot?" "Aye, just so," responded Folliot. "But I don't know you. Who may you be, now?" "My name, sir, is Glassdale," answered the other. "I've just come from your solicitor's. I called to see him this afternoon, and he told me that the business he called about could only be dealt with, or discussed, with you. So I came here." Folliot, who had been cutting slips off a rose tree, closed his knife and put it away in his old jacket. He turned and quietly inspected his visitor once more. "Aye," he said quietly. "So you're after that £1,000 reward, eh?" "I should have no objection to it, Mr. Folliot," replied Glassdale. "I dare say not," remarked Folliot dryly. "I dare say not. And which are you, now? One of those who think they can tell something, or one that really can tell, eh?" "You'll know that better when we've had a bit of a talk, Mr. Folliot," answered Glassdale, accompanying his reply with a direct glance. "Oh, well, now then, I've no objection to a bit of talk, none whatever," said Folliot. "Here, we'll sit down on that bench amongst the roses. Quite private here, nobody about. And now," he continued, as Glassdale accompanied him to a rustic bench set beneath a pergola of rambler roses, "who are you, like? I read a queer account in this morning's local paper of what happened in the cathedral grounds yonder last night, and there was a person of your name mentioned. Are you that Glassdale?" "The same, Mr. Folliot," answered the visitor promptly. "Then you knew Braden, the man who lost his life here?" asked Folliot. "Very well indeed," replied Glassdale. "For how long?" demanded Folliot. "Some years as a mere acquaintance, seen now and then," answered Glassdale. "A few years recently as what you might call a close friend." "Tell you any of his secrets?" asked Folliot. "Yes, he did," answered Glassdale. "Anything that seems to relate to his death and the mystery about it?" inquired Folliot. "I think so," said Glassdale. "Upon consideration, I think so." "Ah, and what might it be, now?" continued Folliot. He gave Glassdale a look which seemed to denote and imply several things. "It might be to your advantage to explain a bit, you know," he added. "One has to be a little vague, eh?" "There was a certain man that Braden was very anxious to find," said Glassdale. "He'd been looking for him for a good many years." "A man?" asked Folliot. "One?" "Well, as a matter of fact, there were two," admitted Glassdale, "but there was one in particular. The other, the second, so Braden said, didn't matter. He was, or had been, only a sort of cat's paw of the man he especially wanted." "I see," said Folliot. He pulled out a cigar case and offered a cigar to his visitor, afterwards lighting one himself. "And what did Braden want that man for?" he asked. Glassdale waited until his cigar was in full going order before he answered this question. Then he replied in one word. "Revenge." Folliot put his thumbs in the armholes of his buff waistcoat and, leaning back, seemed to be admiring his roses. "Ah," he said at last. "Revenge, now. A sort of vindictive man, was he? Wanted to get his knife into somebody, eh?" "He wanted to get something of his own back from a man who'd done him," answered Glassdale, with a short laugh. "That's about it." For a minute or two both men smoked in silence. Then Folliot, still regarding his roses, put a leading question. "Give you any details?" he asked. "Enough," said Glassdale. "Braden had been done, over a money transaction, by these men, one especially, as head and front of the affair, and it had cost him more than anybody would think. Naturally he wanted, if he ever got the chance, his revenge. Who wouldn't?" "And he tracked 'em down, eh?" asked Folliot. "There are questions I can answer, and there are questions I can't answer," responded Glassdale. "That's one of the questions I've no reply to, for I don't know. But I can say this. He hadn't tracked 'em down the day before he came to Wrychester." "You're sure of that?" asked Folliot. "He didn't come here on that account?" "No, I'm sure he didn't," answered Glassdale readily. "If he had, I should have known. I was with him till noon the day he came here, in London, and when he took his ticket at Victoria for Wrychester he'd no more idea than the man in the moon as to where those men had got to. He mentioned it, as it were, having a bit of lunch together before he got on the train. No, he didn't come to Wrychester for any such purpose as that. But—" He paused and gave Folliot a meaning glance out of the corner of his eyes. "Aye? What?" asked Folliot. "I think he met at least one of them here," said Glassdale quietly, "and perhaps both." "Leading to misfortune for him?" suggested Folliot. "If you'd like to put it that way, yes," assented Glassdale. Folliot smoked a while in more reflective silence. "Aye, well," he said at last, "I suppose you haven't put these ideas of yours before anybody now?" "Present ideas?" asked Glassdale sharply. "Not to a soul. I've not had 'em very long." "You're the sort of man that another man can do a deal with, I suppose?" suggested Folliot. "That is, if it's made worth your while, of course." "I shouldn't wonder," replied Glassdale. "And if it is made worth my while." Folliot mused a little. Then he tapped Glassdale's elbow. "You see," he said confidentially, "it might be, you know, that I had a little purpose of my own in offering that reward. It might be that it was a very particular friend of mine that had the misfortune to have incurred this man Braden's hatred. And I might want to save him, d'ye see, from, well, from the consequence of what's happened. And to hear about it first if anybody came forward, eh?" "As I've done," said Glassdale. "Yes, as you've done," assented Folliot. "Now, perhaps it would be in the interest of this particular friend of mine if he made it worth your while to say no more to anybody, eh?" "Very much worth his while, Mr. Folliot," declared Glassdale. "Aye, well," continued Folliot, "this very particular friend would just want to know, you know, how much you really, truly know. Now, for instance, about these two men, and one in particular that Braden was after. Did he name 'em?" Glassdale leaned a little nearer to his companion on the rose-screened bench. "He named them to me," he said in a whisper. "One was a man called Falkiner Wraye, and the other was a man named Flood. Is that enough?" "I think you'd better come and see me this evening," answered Folliot. "Come just about dusk to that door. I'll meet you there. Fine roses these of mine, aren't they?" he continued as they rose. "I occupy myself entirely with them." He walked with Glassdale to the garden door, and stood there watching his visitor go away up the side of the high wall until he turned into the path across Paradise. And then, as Folliot was retreating to his roses, he saw Bryce coming over the close, and Bryce beckoned to him. End of chapter 24.